What else? What else is he referencing in his argument? Talk to me, please, Chavez.
Well, he references the cradle of Confederacy.
Yeah, I told you that. What else is he pulling at?
Support for segregation?
Oh, yeah, I think he gives a little bit of support for segregation. That's reasonable. What else?
He doesn't like the progress the president is making.
Okay, he doesn't like the idea of progress. Sure. What else? He references a specific thing he's pushing back on. The word.
Freedom.
He's pushing back on freedom? He's referencing that's my favorite thing. He said, let's all go back to the freedom that's inside of us. And it's like, bro, you're like the antithesis of freedom. It's a word he uses to push back on what's happening in the country. Anybody? No, the word he uses is tyranny.
Oh, yeah.
Josue, what is tyranny?
It's like king.
Yeah, kind of, but a king is more of a monarchy. A king cannot be a tyrant, but a tyrant can be a king. What is tyranny?
A single ruler who's very needy. He does things to support his own benefit.
Not necessarily. Too much power. Too much power to the government. You see what I'm saying? Like King George was a tyrant and a king. Right? Not all kings are tyrants. Not all tyrants are kings. The idea of a tyranny, a tyrannical system, is that the government has too much power. So what kind of system is he arguing for? What kind of society does he want to reference ourselves back to? States' rights. Good. So Wallace is arguing pro-states' rights. Right? The central government should not have so much power so as to tell us what to do here in our state of Alabama. They don't know, Brett. They just don't know. That's how we do it down here. Otherwise, he says, I'm going to draw a line in the dust. Everything in the South is dusty. I like that. Says, I'm drawing here today to draw a line in the South against this tyrannical system of the federal government telling us what to do. Segregation today, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. It's wild. It's bold. But it's 1960s Southern society. Now, who in the American system of government, who has the final say? The federal government or the state governments? Federal government. We've tried this a couple times. Calhoun tried it. Nullification. The entire South tried it. Secession. And we keep going back that at the end of the day, the federal government, our national government, federal authority, has supremacy over state authority. Always. But does that mean that states stop trying to exert the idea of states' rights? No. It's one of the themes. We talked about themes on Saturday if you were here. We were trying some long-term things to broad themes. It was quite a healthy discussion, actually. And this is one of the long-term themes in American history, is that there's always a conflict between state rights and federal authority. Today's no different. I mean, today in terms of lecture, but also today in terms of 2019 America. Some of the discussions today in 2019 America are about the same thing. We talk about legalization of marijuana. Right? Some states have been legalizing marijuana despite the fact that it is illegal nationally. We talk about 10 years ago, the conflict was gay marriage. Right? Well, some states were legalizing gay marriage despite the fact that the nation only recognized marriage in a man and a woman. Sanctuary cities. Right? In theory, that's a local government saying we're not going to listen to federal law on immigrants. So it's an always conflict. And in this conflict specifically, George Wallace is there to say, no. I and us, the people of Alabama, will rise up against this tyrannical federal government and we will fight for segregation. And what was the crowd's reaction? They were freaking wild. Yeah! Alabama! It was all just one family. So, moral of the story though, like that is a good place to start our conversation on the 1960s. On the 1960s. And we'll look at the 1960s like we looked at the 1950s, like we looked at the late 1940s, through the lens of a presidency in terms of LBJ's 1960s. Lyndon Baines Johnson is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating characters in American history. I know you guys read about him. I'm sure the first 12 pages of your chapter, you're like, damn, this guy's awesome. Right? Civil rights movement, war on poverty, Medicare, Medicaid. You're like, this guy's fascinating. Right? Keeping in mind that we're going to have some pretty significant movement on political parties right here in the 1960s that I want you to vibe with for just a second. All right. We have our two main parties, yes, our Republicans and who? Our Democrats, right? Right now in the 1960s, who has become the more liberal party of the two? Democrats. Right? The Democrats are the more liberal party. The Republicans are more conservative. But there's a chunk of the Democrats who are more conservative. Who are they? Yeah, the Southern Democrats, who we all often call, in this time period, the Dixiecrats. Right? And it's not all just about race. I want you to remove that from the conversation. It's about role of the government. How much should the government get involved in our day-to-day lives? Liberals are going to argue that we should have more government, more programs, more spending, more aggressive policies. Conservatives always are going to be more in favor of states' rights. Small government, less involvement. Yeah, whatever. So the moral of this story is LBJ, where's he from? He's from Texas. Where's Texas? Texas is the South. So we can assume he is a Southern Democrat, but he is not, in fact, a Dixiecrat. Because he believes in big government. Because he's from the South, we can't necessarily categorize all people under these labels. So he's a Southern Democrat with a Southern drawl, Southern accent, Southern perspectives. Read freaking racist. Who truly evolves his views on society over his career to a point where arguably he's the most important civil rights president, with the only real comparison being Lincoln. That's crazy for a Democrat from Texas. So as I think about like the American figures I find most interesting to study, he's always in my top 3 or 4. Always. Right? Not that he's the best or the worst or whatever, just in terms of like fascination, I think he's phenomenal. He does all the things that JFK, Eliam's favorite president, says he was going to do and didn't do. And ideally, by the end of this week, by Wednesday, you're going to be a really big fan of LBJ's. If I do my job right, you'll be a really big fan of LBJ's by Wednesday, and then on Monday, you'll hate him.
Wilson?
Kind of, but worse. So, we'll see. I'll let you guys be the judges of that. No, not Hoover hate. He does things. No, he's just conflicted, right? If you ranked your presidents, and you ranked like presidents on domestic policy versus presidents on foreign policy, yeah, like FDR's pretty much close to the top for both. But LBJ, for domestic policy, is right there with FDR. And then on foreign policy, you have Vietnam. And then you're like, well. So, your prompt is here. Don't worry, you guys will have a chance to debate all these, who's more important, who's more impactful than others. We'll have a huge like March Madness style bracket for our first day of review. It gets wild. It's always fun. What?
Presidents?
Of who I consider the 64 most important people, not all presidents at all. Not just people. Right? Yeah, well, we got to get there first. Yeah, college basketball tournament, but for English people. It's dope. All right, your prompt is here. Johnny, read it first, please.
Evaluate the extent to which the civil rights movement and Great Society demonstrated change in American society and politics.
Cool. So what's the big change for both of these things? Civil rights movement and LBJ's Great Society. What's the big change? What do they have in common change-wise? Looking up here. What do they have in common change-wise?
Changing of the political parties?
Not so much. Not so much. The role of government. They're both movements, programs are going to significantly increase the role of government in America. So if you're a liberal, you like that. If you are a conservative, you despise that. It's quite that simple. Now for 85% of today, we'll be focusing on just the civil rights movement itself, what's happening with the civil rights movement. And then by the end of today, hopefully, time willing, if not, we'll do it Wednesday, don't worry about it. We'll talk about LBJ and the Great Society, and we'll talk about war in court. Now, I've only asked you really to know one other court system, martial court. So if I'm asking you to know a whole other court system, we can assume it's probably pretty impactful. You could say that war in court has just as or close to as big of an impact on American society and legacies going forward as does martial court. But both of them have in common, what do martial court decisions do?
Establish
Establish and reinforce federal supremacy and a bigger role for the government. War in court, same thing. Right, so all of the important war in court decisions, things like Brown versus Board of Education, things like Gideon versus Wainwright, some really important citizenship type of rulings. So let's take a step back in time and talk about the Jim Crow South. Why is a civil rights movement needed? Take a second. Let's talk about this with your partner. Why is a civil rights movement needed, A, and B, why shouldn't it have been needed? 1 minute, go for it. Go. Go. Yeah.
That's why it should be given to 5% of college.
Huh?
And the reason that maybe
Does she know we're gay?
Why shouldn't it be needed? 20 seconds.
yeah, they should have already been.
Like, why was like Jim Crow laws necessary? That was like Jim Crow. I think for Jim Crow was a women's civil rights law. That
That's what I like to hear.
They were different because they were white women. I'm guessing they weren't. They just
All right. So let's do it quite simply. Santos, why is the civil rights movement needed?
Reconstruction failed.
Reconstruction failed. That's reasonable. Why shouldn't the civil rights movement have been needed?
There were policies passed during Reconstruction. I think there was a Civil Rights Act.
Not even just policies. What's bigger than policies? What's bigger than acts?
Also,
Yeah. Right, like we have constitutional amendments. 13th we're not discussing anymore because, yeah, there's no more slavery. But what does the 14th Amendment give? Citizenship, right? The equal protection of the law, that everybody's equal under the eyes of the law. What does the 15th Amendment give?
Suffrage.
Yeah, that black people, you cannot be denied the right to vote based on your race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And yet we're sitting here, to Santos's point, talking about citizenship and voting rights for African Americans, despite the fact that 100 years prior these things were done. 100 years. That's wild. So what happens post-Reconstruction is the federal government stops enforcing the laws. This is why I put this little grid up here for you. That when the federal government stops enforcing these amendments, you allow the states to kind of do whatever it is the states want to do. So we see southern states finding a way, we'll call them loopholes. Loopholes around the 15th Amendment. Loopholes around or through the 14th Amendment. In a way that allows them to keep black people from voting, and that is the foundation of everything. I cannot stress, this is more of a life lesson than an A-push lesson, that when only white people vote, and then the politicians that are elected will create policies that benefit white people. Your democracy is a representation of who votes in it. Why should the government create a policy to benefit you if you're not going to vote? Sure, we can talk about like theory and ideology, and people should be idealistically better. Yeah, cool. But if only white people are the electorate, then those that get elected only need to make policies that address those white people. Think about it. Hector, what is every politician's first goal? To get reelected. He takes 8, you go. And if every politician's only first, second, third, and fourth goal is to get reelected, then how do they get reelected? To create policies that benefit those that elect them. So by taking away the ballot first, you then take away the idea that government even represents these people. Government represents those that put them there. I think Fabio, you want me to issue that there? Yeah, check it out. Because you got it off the chair. So, what we see by these state governments, states like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Virginia, Georgia, is the use of 3 things to keep black people from voting. And when you keep somebody from voting, you don't need to worry about making policies that are unpopular with them because they don't have to vote anyway. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses are 3 of the significant legal ways that we see southern states keeping black people from voting. Grandfather clauses are all sorts of terrible. Think about it. You can't vote here unless your grandfather voted here in this county. And in the 1880s, African Americans are like, well, my grandfather was a slave, so no, he didn't vote. But that's just one generation. What happens 2 generations later? Did their grandfather vote? No, because they couldn't because their grandfather was a slave. So it just keeps this tree of disenfranchisement, which is going to go generation to generation to generation. Literacy tests are basically impossible to pass. Poll taxes indiscriminately attack the lower class. You have a choice between eating and voting. You're always going to pick eating, especially because most black people in the South are sharecroppers. Right? They are tenant farmers that never have the kind of cash to pay a poll tax because they're always farming and they're always in debt because of the farming and sharecropping situation. And not just that, if you were in an area that didn't have these things, the KKK is there to reinforce the idea of fear about voting. So there's political reasons, but also then social reasons. And all of that concludes in 1896 with the monumentally important Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which established the doctrine of separate but equal. Then it's totally cool to segregate some people, as long as they're given access to equal facilities. So I can put you on one part of the bus and you on the other part of the bus. Sorry, you're on the same bus, it should be just fine. I can send you to one school and you to another school. It's like, hey, you're both going to school, what's the big deal? So what's the problem with that? What's the problem in legally creating a segregated society? What do you guys think? You guys are going to college in a year and a half? What if you all went to the Cal State LA that was for students of color? Same college, same campus, same classes, same everything, but you went to the school that was for brown kids. What's the problem with that? You guys have a problem with that? Why? What gives you the right to go to school with white people? You don't see white kids running the hallway here, except me. So what's the problem? Why do you want so badly to go to an integrated school if you barely go to an integrated school right now? Do you have a problem with the fact that there are no white kids at your school? No. But what if there was a white school next door? Now do you have a problem? Why not?
They're forgetting to sing.
Oh, you are? Talk to me.
Would it be because they're offered more resources?
I don't know. What if they weren't?
That's whatever.
Is it? Is it whatever? What if the schools are exactly the same, but that school's for white kids and that school's not? Kid, are you? Are you? If you separate somebody based on the criteria of their race, is there such thing as equal? Think about it.
Oh, because they separate them because one of them has to be superior than the other.
In theory, what if they're not even doing it based on superior reasons, but rather just to keep the races separate? What does that imply? That implies at some point that we as humans shouldn't and can't interact in the same space. So think about it. What if when you went to go to apply to college, right? UCLA, Cal State LA, USC, whatever. And you had to pick the brown campus or the white campus. They're both colleges, what's the big deal? Think about it though. Because that's the argument. You guys are kind of coming to the wrong consensus of like, oh, if it's separate but it's the same thing, then I don't really see what the big deal is. And that's a problem.
Is it like saying that, although everybody getting the same thing, is it kind of saying like, oh, you can't
Can you get the same thing if you are at the very foundation of what you're getting separated based on race? That's the question. So I want you to understand that first and foremost, the civil rights movement doesn't just wake up and happen in the 1950s. Movements don't happen by accident. Movements don't happen overnight. In the 1890s, we talked about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington as advocating for social change, for political change, for economic change for African Americans. Of course, W.E.B. Du Bois is advocating for change from the top-down perspective. Remember, his approach is called the talented 10th, of educate the top of black society and let white people then see how talented black people can be. Whereas Booker T. Washington is arguing more from a bottom-up perspective, of give black people a trade, a vocation, a job, and let them build their way up. 1909, the NAACP is formed and founded. It took first period like 15 minutes to figure out what the hell the NAACP stood for. Let's check you guys. Chavez, go for it. False. Ooh, of course you know. This is some separate but equal nonsense. Jesus. Daniel, what do you think?
Come back to me.
Nope. Slaney. I know Josue knows. Josue, I have to tell you guys.
Yeah, I know too.
National Association of Advancement of Colored People.
That a boy. Jennery's got National Association. I know he was. For the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Everybody always thinks it's African American. Right? So the NAACP is formed to find. They're going to play a huge role in today's conversation. Even Marcus Garvey, the 1910s and 20s, for his Back to Africa movements. Back to Africa. Yeah. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And the Harlem Renaissance. Right, we're talking in the 20s. The Harlem Renaissance is a big push. Louis Armstrong, way more important than him, Langston Hughes, the author. So it's important that we understand that black people don't just stop advocating. It doesn't just go, so often it's like, oh, there's Reconstruction, and then here's the Civil Rights Movement. Well, what happened in between? In between are some important things. The New Deal, unfortunately, enforces some segregation policies that you guys saw in that video. Both World Wars, we see segregated military units. So that reinforces segregation and discrimination. So there's some progress, but there's also some societal pushbacks on this progress. And we really start seeing the roots of this movement in the 1940s. Who's the president we got to give a lot of credit to for kind of kickstarting the civil rights movement? No, not Kennedy. No.
LBJ?
No. Truman. Because it's Truman that desegregates the armed forces and the federal government, right? So the 1940s, we started seeing some success, right? By the 1940s, the Great Migration is complete, which of course began during World War I as African Americans are leaving the South for industrial war jobs. So that breaks sharecropping. That's big, right? There's not this huge needed labor force in the South of black farmers that break sharecropping. Now we see black people in northern cities, right? So one of the reasons we have the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s when we did. World War II, we can give FDR a little bit of credit for getting the Fair Employment Practice Committee to start investigating discrimination in the workplace. Especially as FDR desegregates the armed services industries, also that are supplying the war. We talked about the war. Why did he do that? Why did FDR finally desegregate those armed forces supplying industries? Why? Talked about it in class. Why did FDR decide to desegregate all these industries that are supplying the war? Out of the goodness of his heart?
No.
Because African American workers threatened to march to Washington.
Yep, that threatened to march on Washington, right? Which would have looked really bad during war if you're trying to fight for to end fascism abroad, and then your black workers are going on a huge strike and marching to Washington. Good job. Right, that march on Washington was part of A. Philip Randolph, an important name in this conversation, his double V campaign. Victory over fascism abroad, victory for democracy at home. So yeah, all of that takes place in the context of World War II, and then after World War II, Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson breaks the color line in baseball, which maybe sounds meaningless to you guys now, but baseball is America's pastime, America's most popular sport. And now at the highest level, you see a black baseball player who is not just competing, but one of the best players in the game. And he's local. Jackie Robinson, he's local. He went to Pasadena High School. Excuse me, who's John Muir? Alive. In Pasadena, up the street. He went to UCLA. He was, I think, a 4 or 5 sport athlete at UCLA. Right? Football, basketball, baseball, track and field. He's freaking crazy. Right? Right? Because it's funny, right? Like all these white people are like, we're good at sports, and then black people show up, and it's like, yeah. So we see some success in the 1940s. Truman, of course, gives some credit. He creates a federal commission on civil rights in 1946. Of course, remember I told you guys about his policies last week, about how he's kind of stopped by the Southern Democrats and the conservatives. He wants to push for more civil rights without much luck. But he does create this commission to investigate civil rights, which is important. Also, the fact that this is a monumental achievement is sad. But he publicly calls for an end to lynching in his presidency. Alright, like, hey, you guys should stop hanging black people from trees. And the fact that he's the president that has to call for this in 1947 when it happens is alarming. Alarming. And his lasting legacy, civil rights-wise, is that desegregation we talked about of the armed forces and the national government. Of course, undoing, as was pointed out last class, what Wilson did in his presidency. Executive Order 9980 and 9981. So, of course, it's not that civil rights just kind of went away. It's that society really kept these movements and these pushes down. And that's all going to change beginning in the 1950s. So this is up here for you guys as a reference slide if you want it. It goes over Reconstruction, the Progressive Era gains, the 1920s with the race riots and the return of the KKK, and also the New Deal. One thing that I will say, though, about the New Deal and FDR is it becomes the first time that black people vote with the Democrat Party in large numbers. And that's important. So as the Democrats become taking on civil rights, it's largely back to the point about elections, right? And they're a voting bloc for Democrats. It makes a lot of sense. So just a reference slide as you guys frantically look at PowerPoint on the night of May 9th for your test, which will not help with that point. I'll have to email you guys yesterday. Yesterday was just 2-month warning. We have less than 2 months as of today.
It's on May 10th?
May 10th.
We have 8 on.
Cool, good job, Rubia. Nobody cares. Now, the modern civil rights movement, most historians would argue, begins in 1954 and ends in 1965. Now, I'd make a better argument, I think, that says that the civil rights movement doesn't actually end, but rather it evolves into trying to embrace other groups. But when we talk about the civil rights movement, APUSH-wise, it's this time period in the 50s and 60s of African Americans advocating for the government, as liberals, to get more involved in guaranteeing their rights. All right. After the civil rights movement, we see the Chicano rights movement, the gay rights movements, the Native American rights movements, and it's important that all of those build off of the legacies of this civil rights movement in a much more similar way. So it really starts, let me erase this over here because I'm going to need both boards today. It starts with schools. And we're going to look at the civil rights movement through three lenses. First is the courts. Second is the activists. And third is the government. Should make pretty good sense to you guys. And the big important thing to look at is the NAACP. Rubia, what does the NAACP stand for? Don't look at your notes, Rubia. This is important. National Advancement. Good.
National Association and Advancement for Colored People.
God, she even called them colored people. That's messed up. They're called African Americans, all right? I'm kidding, you're fine. So, the NAACP is monumentally important here. Here. It's the NAACP who will be fighting for the protection of black rights in the court system. And that's going to lay the foundation for everything else. Everything else. Now, in the early 50s, the NAACP begins challenging segregationist policies in the courts. They first begin targeting graduate admissions for grad schools, asking schools, like, how come you don't admit any black students? Why do none of your you always say that black people should pick themselves up by their bootstraps. How come all these grad schools don't have black students in them? How it is to pick themselves up without access to graduate education? And this eventually translates to challenging Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, the name to know here is Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was a monumentally significant person in the story. He's going to use the clauses in the 14th Amendment to attack school segregation. Which is the 14th Amendment? Yeah, so 14th is citizenship. 15th is suffrage. So this is more of an AP Gov thing, but the 14th Amendment has what's called an equal protection clause. And under this equal protection and then a citizenship clause, the basic gist of it is that everybody has to be equal under the law. That the law of America needs to be applied to all people equally. That justice should be blind. So he's going to use these qualifiers in the 14th Amendment and then argue, hey, look, according to these words that are in our amendments, this policy of separate but equal is unconstitutional. It's a good strategy. And they pick pretty smart schools to test this on, court case-wise. As Thurgood Marshall, he's originally just a NAACP lawyer, really like the only one. He eventually becomes like the chief legislative lawyer for the NAACP. And the argument that Marshall gives is that even equal schools, if the schools are exactly the same, they provide the exact same quality of education, same amount of funding, same quality of teachers, same books, same resources, same building, even perfectly equal schools are going to inflict profound psychological damage on black kids. By making kids go to a school based on their race, this idea of separation is inherently unequal. He brings in these little girls, these little black girls, and he gives them both dolls, a white doll and a black doll. He says, which one's prettier? And they all pick the white doll. And of course, that part's all acted out and rehearsed and made up. But it makes a big impact in the court. They're like, damn, like we really are messing up with these kids. It's terrible. Right? Thurgood Marshall's a genius. He's a genius. And the court case, what's the name of the court case? You guys read about it. As we challenged Plessy versus Ferguson, it was 2 chapters ago. Y'all embarrassing. Brown versus Board of Education. Yeah. So in Brown versus Board of Education, who is the Board of Education? Which board are they suing? Anybody know? No, it's not. It's in Topeka, Kansas. On purpose, that's the point. Because they pick a school district that has 4 brand new high schools. 2 white schools, 2 black schools. All 4 schools are built by the same architect at the same time. They're all 4 good, fine schools. And that's their whole point, is that like even, because their whole argument is to get to this point that even if it's equal, it's unequal. It would be easy to go to Alabama and be like, look, this is a nice school, these guys are in a shack. That's easy to see that's not fair. But in order to prove this precedent of separate but equal was wrong, they had to make it so that even when it was really equal, it really was unequal. Does that make sense? Yeah. So they used the Topeka, Kansas School Board instead. And the Supreme Court makes a unanimous decision in this case. That never happens. 9-0. Ruling that separate facilities, by simply being separate, are by themselves inherently unequal. Unequal. Now the call for the Supreme Court is that all the states should desegregate their schools at, in the words of the court, a deliberate speed. How does the South read this? What does deliberate mean? If you're very deliberate. Carefully, intentionally. The South reads this as deliberately slow. Question for you guys. Can the Supreme Court enforce its own rulings?
No.
How do we know? Speak up, brother.
Huh?
How?
Earlier with Jackson when the Supreme Court ruled against him, but he just ignored them.
Yeah. All right, the Supreme Court ruled the Indians could stay, and Jackson was like, cool. Yeah, to Oklahoma you go. So the whole point is the Supreme Court rules on what's constitutional or not, but who's supposed to be there to enforce laws and policies? Whose job is it to enforce the law? Executive. So this court ruling is important, but the Supreme Court does not get to enforce their own rulings. They have to rely on the rest of the government to do that for them. Border states are in-between states, are semi-southern states. They respond pretty quickly, like Kansas integrates their schools, Missouri integrates their schools, Kentucky integrates their schools. Texas is like, we don't have schools, so we're good. But the Deep South is going to be a problem for the rest of today's conversation, resists. 6 years later, less than 1% of black students go to a school with white people. Less than 1 in every 100 black students in the Deep South, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, less than 1% of them go to school with white kids. What we're doing instead is creating things like pupil placement laws, more loopholes. Pupil placement laws. So we're seeing our states instead create 2 schools. 1 school for the gifted and 1 school for the kids who are a little bit behind. It just so happens that all the white kids are at the gifted school and all the students of color are at the behind school. Sorry. Or schools based on morality. Thank you. Schools based on morality. As the kids that have good morals go to the white school, the kids who are struggling with their morals or behavior go to the black school. So Brown versus Board is super important. What do all court cases create? I've told you guys before, it's precedent. So Brown versus Board creates a precedent. And whenever the Supreme Court makes a ruling, that creates precedent for the rest of the country. And what is the precedent this creates? What precedent does this court case create? No, be more specific. Yes, that segregation is what? Unconstitutional. Because now we can bring a bunch of other court cases, other lawsuits and rulings, and the Supreme Court will use this as their precedent to then rule that segregation is illegal other places as well. Thurgood Marshall, huge success in Brown versus Board, makes him a very household name, a very famous man, most famous black lawyer in America. Also worth noting, in 1967, so 13 years later, he becomes America's first black Supreme Court justice, appointed by LBJ. So a pretty impressive rise from going from having to fight against segregation in schools to being eventually the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Pretty cool. So that's going to make all of our schools integrate, right? Think about this. We're going to have a bunch of black and white schools now. We're all good to go? Yes, no? Christoph, what do you think? Exactly. Sit up straight. What do you think?
What again?
Will our schools all integrate and desegregate quickly?
No, because it's wants to get their way with loopholes like you said.
All right, well, there we go. So let's talk then about one of the first schools with integration, Central High in Little Rock, Arkansas. I have a video clip for you, but I hope you're awake for it, Christoph. Little Rock, Arkansas. Here is Arkansas. Little Rock is dead in the center. We consider Arkansas not the Deep South, but the semi-Deep South. And the governor of Arkansas, a man named Orville Faubus. Yeah, good old Orville. He's very against this idea of school integration. My favorite are these signs. Race mixing is communism. Race mixing is communist. Think about it. Doesn't make any sense at all. But this is one of the trends in American history that when you hate something, you just call it what America's afraid of at the time. America in the 1950s is real scared of communism. So if we just attach race mixing to communism, then everyone will hate that too. These are some great signs. You guys are wearing a tablecloth. Race mixing is communism. Stop the race mixing. Race mixing is communism. So I'll show you this footage of the way that schools get integrated in Little Rock, Arkansas. My boy Orville.
There's no such thing as a...
have these in DVD, but it's in pain.
A direction?
All right. We'll go a little bit into the end of the bus boycott and then into school integration. Hey, kid from Zade's class. Can you go both lights, please?
This is after Rosa Parks.
It's right after the parks. They're going to happen at the same time. All right.
The buses bragging about a victory.
People experienced self-esteem that they had never experienced before. And they had been given
For the last 12 months.
a light, a beacon at the end of the tunnel.
That light reached Melba Beals, a 15-year-old high school student in Little Rock, Arkansas.
I was very conscious of what was going on and wanting it to wash over me and wash over Little Rock.
It was about to. In 1954, the Supreme Court had ordered the integration of all public schools in its famous decision Brown versus the Board of Education. 3 years later, that decision would be severely tested at Little Rock's all-white Central High School.
So this is my point, right? The court can make their ruling, but the court can't then enforce their ruling. That's the way the system is set up. So the court has ruled that segregated schools is unconstitutional. And here we have the first day of school in Little Rock, Arkansas at Central High, and it's the first day we're going to have black and white kids going to school together. Arkansas, this is pretty quick. It's only 3 years later, right? So if you try to create a system that's going to put black and white kids in school together, it might not happen overnight. So we're 3 years out, and it's the first day of school in Arkansas.
Despite the federal court order, Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus had no intention of allowing black students to attend Central High, and he ordered the Arkansas National Guard to surround the school.
So the governor sends Arkansas's National Guard, Arkansas is like state militia, so to speak, to surround the school and not let black kids in. Imagine, you'll see some good footage, imagine caring that much about who kids went to school with. There you go. It wasn't about slavery though, right? It's about states' rights. Yeah.
Our class?
On September the 3rd, Melba Beals and 8 other black students walked towards Central High. One, Elizabeth Eckford, became separated from her friends and was surrounded by a white mob that included Ann Thompson.
There was just a lot of electricity in the air. It was almost a circus-like atmosphere. All these parents on the sideline urging us on and telling us, get out there, don't let them get in. There are mobs on her heels, like dogs, living her. Policemen are watching this. Every time she tries to step between them, they close ranks on her.
That footage is crazy, it's kind of hard to tell, but you see like Arkansas State Police just watching this black girl get absolutely verbally annihilated. People in her face, spitting on her, and they're just like, man, this is crazy. They're doing the James Buchanan treatment. Don't do that, man. That's messed up. No. You did it. Yeah, you did it. Don't do it again. Ah, you did it again. So, we look at like who enforces law. Like who's supposed to be here to enforce the law? The police. What's the police doing? Ignoring it. And the state militia is there to enforce the idea that these black guys are going to school either.
If Central High was to be integrated, it would have to be by order of the president. Eisenhower was at first reluctant to interfere.
His record on civil rights was not a good one until 1957, the crisis at Little Rock. And there, a fundamental question was dealt with. Do the states have the right to impose their own social order in defiance of federal court orders?
Do the states have the right to create their own social order in defiance of federal court? What do we think? We have an answer to this question. We've answered this already. What's the answer? No. No, the federal government has the final say, but the federal government only has the final say when they choose to enforce it and exert their power on the states. So Eisenhower, as he just says, does not have the best record on civil rights. He does not. He's a Republican in the 1950s. Now it's his chance to decide what's he going to do.
It's their own social order in defiance of federal court orders. Eisenhower answered decisively, said, no, we have made a national commitment. We are going to desegregate this society. And if it takes the 101st Airborne to do it, so be it.
This is awful. That is vivid still. You know,
So Eisenhower sends the freaking army. He sends the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock, and they literally walk these kids into school and follow them all around for the whole semester.
The white kids?
No, the black kids. The Little Rock, not the 9 black kids going to school.
just see Little Rock just being in a state of siege by the troops, you know. That was real fear.
Three weeks after the Little Rock Nine were turned away from Central High, they returned, accompanied by troops of the 101st Airborne.
We're all in an Army station wagon, machine gun mounts. It's a pretty heady day. It's not what everybody gets to go to school. You got 1,000 paratroopers, you got helicopters, jeeps in front, jeeps behind.
And we stepped out of the Jeep into this square of soldiers who were serious. You know, as I walked up the steps that day at Central High School, I can remember the click of the leather boots on those stairs. And I remember being so impressed by who they were. You know, these are Americans. I'm an American. And so the first time I get the feeling that there is hope, that there is a reason I salute the flag, that this is what America is about.
I felt that Little Rock would never be the same again. We would never know life as we've known it again.
Poor thing.
Because 9 people walked into a school building.
So, moral of the story, what we see instead as Sundays. Now, what we see instead is here's Eisenhower's federal government choosing to enforce the law, to ensure that the federal government is there to ensure that schools get desegregated. Very nice. Here's some good pictures for you as well. There they are. They're called the Little Rock Nine. These first 9 kids to go to a segregated school in Little Rock, Arkansas. This is a very famous picture. Very famous picture of the first day. And to me, like, this is the best juxtaposition in American history ever. We have her, cool, collected, calm, could not be bothered. Her first day of school. And this teenage girl behind her losing her goddamn mind. It's a very famous picture. But I always urge you guys, every year I teach this, don't be this person in history. These things last forever. I'm sure this is a very lovely lady. I'm sure she came a long way. She did come a long way. But she can never remove the fact that on this first day of school at Little Rock, Arkansas at Central High, she was the one behind this girl hollering at her every racist thing she could think of. There's a good synthesis opportunity for you guys now and social media. Right? Don't be that person in 30 years who has to look back and be like, yeah, I couldn't get that done in life. I couldn't have that opportunity because I put a bunch of offensive stuff in my social media. Okay? There she is. But look at the faces. Right, here comes the 101st Airborne Division literally marching these kids into school, exerting federal authority in a way that's going to set the ball rolling for other school integrations. So now check this out. If you are another district and another school and you watch this happen to Little Rock, are you trying to keep your schools segregated?
No.
No. Because you know that if you do, like, the Army's going to be sent to your city and they're going to force integration. So the idea of the federal government enforcing the policy is a big deal. Now, at basically the same time as school integration is taking place, we also have the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955. You guys all know this story. It's a very famous story. It makes a huge difference. Rosa Parks, obviously we know all about her. She sits down in the white section of the bus. They tell her to move. She won't move. We make her look like this sad little old grandma after a hard day of work. No, she's an activist. Yeah. This is, we talk about the court section. This is more of the activist section. This is planned. This is not the first time she's been arrested for sitting in the white section of the bus. But what they're trying to do is make a statement. What these activists are trying to do, like any sort of activist, is raise public opinion and make a statement. In this case, the entire black community in Montgomery, Alabama, a huge black community, every one of them boycotts the bus. Think about right now. What communities ride the bus the most?
Minorities.
Minorities. Right? So in a place like Montgomery, 85% of the bus ridership was black people. So if those people stop riding the bus, what happens in the bus business? What do you guys think? If black people stop riding the bus, what happens to bus income? Yeah, they lose all their money, right? They can't pay their buses. They can't pay their bus mechanics. They can't do any of these important things. And all we see in these black communities is a carpool system as the black community migrates themselves together to try to protest segregation. The Supreme Court then, once this is being called to their attention, they're going to follow the precedent of Brown versus Board and rule that bus segregation also is unconstitutional. This is why Brown versus Board matters so much, and the success of this movement also then leads to the rise of MLK as the civil rights leader. So the bus boycott is a big deal because it demonstrates that what the black community is capable of when they are organized, when they all work together, when they're all on the same page. Now that's basically it for the 1950s. The 1950s and 1960s, we see the election of JFK as president. Now I ask you in your first question, what does the election mean for America? Let's talk about this. I'm sorry to break Eliam's bubble. That's not the go. JFK's presidency does not accomplish much. However, he's too mad. I'm trying to fight me at lunch. JFK's presidency does not accomplish much, but I will say that his election accomplishes a ton. Think about that for a second. JFK is young, liberal, and Catholic. And America elects him. So politically and socially and culturally, that means that America is moving themselves in a more progressive liberal direction. You can make the same argument for Obama. The election of Obama was way more impactful than anything he did as president. Think about it. Because it says more about our society as a whole than any actions a man can take as president. Did Obama make some important actions as president? Sure, absolutely. But his election said more about society than did his actions as president. JFK is the same thing. So JFK, the fact that America elects him as a young Catholic liberal says that America is leaning in a more socially, politically, and culturally liberal direction. JFK wants to expand social welfare. He does not because of Southern Democrats and conservatives in Congress. JFK does, however, pass the Clean Air Act, which becomes kind of the start of the environmental movement. We'll talk about that more in the 1970s. Very important. But under him, we see the Freedom Riders. We'll read about that in a second. We're going to see George Wallace again in a second as he tries to keep black students from going to the University of Alabama. And we see the March on Washington under him as well. Liberalism is absolutely a word. Absolutely a word. Under JFK's presidency, we start seeing the rise of feminists. The re-rise of feminism under this book, The Feminine Mystique, which we'll read a chunk of next week. And we'll hit his foreign policy stuff as well. We talk about Vietnam on Monday. Because he's the guy who really gets us into Vietnam in the first place. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, JFK. That's what? That's your dad?
It's my guy.
That's your guy? He's dad. Bro, you don't look anything alike. I know he's got a lot of illegitimate children, but that's why I joked that I guess his presidency with the rise of feminism was all these women who he's cheated on who are mad then. So I'm not starting with his wife. Now, the best thing he does as president is Marilyn Monroe. Now, sorry, Leo. So, As he takes the White House, though, it's primarily, not primarily, but a big chunk of why he gets elected is the black vote in the North. So civil rights leaders are expecting him to do a lot on civil rights, and he kind of drags his feet. He drags his feet really slowly on the civil rights thing, which pisses off a lot of these civil rights leaders who thought he would be a big champion of their cause. So what civil rights leaders start doing instead is they start forcing him. They start doing things that are going to make him act. Make him prove to the community that he is what he said he was. The two things that we're going to focus on for the next 10-15 minutes are CORE and the Freedom Rides, as well as Ole Miss and University of Alabama's student involvement. So we talked about CORE as a group. They're one of the important civil rights organizations. We talked about them first in World War II, as organizing that March on Washington that Jeremy pointed out. They're going to lead a freedom ride on buses in 1961 to try to end segregation on interstate buses. At the same time, we're going to see a bunch of local black activists pushing to break a ban, an actual ban on black students going to the University of Alabama and Ole Miss, which is basically University of Mississippi. So first, you're going to read about the Freedom Ride, but here's a map to show you. It was illegal for segregated buses to cross state lines, specifically in the South. So we're going to see a bunch of black bus riders getting on like Greyhound buses, basically. You guys have all seen Greyhound buses before. And riding those buses into the South to see what would happen. Like those long-term buses. You ever go on the Northern California field trip? Like a charter bus, yeah, so to speak. So what we're going to see, though, is CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, getting together other black activists to willingly ride buses into the South to see what would happen, try to expose problems. We're going to read about it right now. So you're going to read two chunks. The first chunk, I'm going to have you stop with that, we'll discuss it, comes from James Farmer. He's one of the organizers of CORE. So he's one of the facilitators of this Freedom Rider event. We're going to read his, and you're going to answer the first two questions. What were the goals, and then how did they prepare? Then we'll discuss this, and then I'll have you actually read an excerpt from somebody who was on the Freedom Ride. So somebody who actually had to go sit down and do it, and then the experience will be quite different. Yeah. So take 5 minutes. On the first one, you'll stop where it says Hank Thomas, because that's the second perspective. So where it says Hank Thomas, stop. So just where it says they didn't make any arrests, stop there, take 5 minutes, read it, and then we'll discuss it. Go. Yeah, go ahead. Is your homework time? Keep reading. You back here? You're reading. 4 minutes. Look up. 3 minutes. preparation like? What are their goals? Good text. You didn't do it. About 30 or so more seconds, just for the first chunk, the organizer of the Freedom Ride. Right. Take one with your partner and jump in. What are their goals? What is their preparation like? What are these individuals doing and why? 1 minute, go for it. Go, go, go. Go, go, go. Dive in. I will. My soul.
For the freedom riders was to get all recognition.
That's what I'm saying. This is homework at 2:00 tonight.
Segregation was unjust.
It's even worse.
So
what did you do all day after boot camp was ended? You went to eat.
For how they prepared, I said that they prepared for like reversing possible situations in order to make sure they know what to do in case it's happened, so that their cause like would have like a greater impact on people. And this one they come up and they take out people. What? Like the council came up by they went to the south.
No.
Never mind.
He started working at 8:30 and at 1 he only had his book.
Alright. So what is the goal of this freedom ride? What are they trying to do? Ashley, go for it. What are they trying to do? What's that one more time? Yeah, civil disobedience, right? They're breaking the law. What are they hoping to do with their law breaking? Brett. What are they trying to do?
Oh, they wanted to imitate Gandhi and civil disobedience.
What are they trying to do?
Oh, they were violating segregation principles.
Yeah, they're trying to go to jail. They're trying to go to jail and stay in jail to bring awareness to their problem. Good, good, good. Johnny, how do they train? How do they prepare?
Oh, so they prepare like they act it out before like scenarios that could possibly happen.
Yeah.
So they can like make it more believable.
They prepared by going through scenarios that might happen. Right? They prepared by beating each other up, by verbally abusing each other. Imagine having to prepare for a bus ride by doing that. By getting kicked in the ribs and spit on. And what happens when they get on the bus? Ruby, talk to me. What happened?
They just kept on driving through, like they said.
Where were things okay?
It was part in South Carolina.
Before that, where were things okay? Yeah, Virginia, we were cool. What happened to Virginia? There's no more black and white area sign that Virginia had obviously gotten the message. They were cool. North Carolina was cool. And then what happened in South Carolina, Rubio?
That's where they were waiting. They got kind of, I guess you could say, attacked or verbally attacked. They were telling them that they didn't belong here. And the response was like, yeah, I can be here.
Yeah. So of course the problem started in South Carolina. Surprising nobody. So they get to South Carolina and things go south. No pun intended. And then we see John Lewis. Is the name familiar, anybody? John Lewis is currently a sitting U.S. House of Representatives member from Georgia. So by the 1990s. In the next 30 years, he's going to go from fighting for bus desegregation. He's the guy who almost dies on the Selma Bridge. You guys have ever seen Selma? He almost dies. He gets beaten by a police club on the Selma Bridge. And now he represents Georgia as a member of the House of Representatives. Today. He's in his 70s today. That's my point, guys. That proves more than anything else that this is not that long ago. He's in Congress today. He goes in the waiting room. Several young white hoodlums, leather jackets, duck haircuts, stand there smoking. They block the door and said, "Blank, you can't come in here." And he says, "Yes, I can." And they beat the hell out of him. So jump into the second one. Hank Thomas is one of the guys who actually goes. He's going to tell you what it's like to actually be on the bus as a rider. It's a pretty vivid, terrible story, and I apologize in advance, but I think it's important that we read it. So take 4, read his experience. For both of them, how does their reaction to the protest evolve? What does it prove? That the deeper we go in the South, the worse treatment gets. And then what's most shocking about their experience? Take 4 and read the rest of it. That's the last 2 questions. I think you'll be a little surprised. 4 minutes, go for it. 4 minutes. You're right. Go. wild ending. What?
They had to go outside.
Sorry.
Well, obviously, if they wrote this, they're still alive.
Chavez is like, wait, what? Imagine going to a hospital having them say, like, yeah, we're not going to help you.
That's why. I'll give you a selection to movie.
All right, take one, dive in with your partner. What does this reaction to the freedom rides demonstrate about society? 1 minute, there's a lot here, go for it. Go for it, go for it.
The doctors just pick it up. Turns out you hit the deep south. Debating Scotland. So don't push the deep south. We're not attacking Can we all agree that you shouldn't get involved with the deep south?
You're going steady. Real deal. The bus was exploding. We're Alright. So, this is crazy. Like, let's talk about how crazy this is. That society first responds by saying, well, no, you can't ride that bus or get off here. But then they resort to actual attacking the bus. The idea that he was more comfortable staying on a burning bus than getting off the bus and facing the mob. That's the line that struck me the most. Yeah, the hospital thing sucks. The fact that the state governors, like any rioters in the state, you don't get police protection. We're not going to protect you in the state. That sucks. But his line that says, I couldn't survive that burning bus. There's a possibility I couldn't survive the job, but I was just so afraid of the mob that I was going to stay on the bus. We see in the picture, well, of course, we look at the map. The map has, it's an old map, but it has little asterisks everywhere that there's violence on these freedom rides. And as you see, we have violence all kinds of places. Alabama, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi. Sorry, Luis. And this idea, look at this. In Jackson, Mississippi, 306 people are put in jail. So as you go deeper into the South, the reaction gets harsher, the treatment gets more aggressive. But what you do is you change public opinion. What did every American buy in the 1950s?
Radio.
Car.
Neither and neither. No, TVs. Every American in the 1950s bought a TV, so every American gets to watch all of this playing out on their evening news. So understand that nothing in history happens by accident. Americans are seeing footage like this on their evening news of burned out Greyhound buses, people staggering to the hospital, being turned away. So the freedom rides do a good job of doing what they wanted to, of exposing to the rest of the world what's happening in the Deep South. Concurrently, at the same time, we see a move to desegregate these two schools in the Deep South. One being University of Alabama, one being University of Mississippi. Who's the governor of Alabama? Our friend George Wallace. Here we have the University of Alabama students taking the notice, the order to desegregate from the federal government and burning it. As students, we always say it's old white people that are racist. Here's college students. College students at the University of Alabama having a rally to burn the notice forcing them to desegregate. Confederate flag, Confederate flag, Confederate flag. Upon being forced to integrate, George Wallace stood as governor in the schoolhouse door and said, "You will not desegregate this University of Alabama with me as governor. I'm standing here to block you." I'll show you a clip of what happens here because it's monumentally important as well. What's up? Larry Bird did?
I'm sorry.
And I think when the TV started bringing some of that evil spirit that was out there into the homes, people actually, though, had different reactions. Some of them were actually ashamed of what was going on, and they wanted to get in and try to help bring about change. But there were other people who sort of dug in their heels.
People like Alabama Governor George Wallace, who blocked the integration of the state university by literally standing in the door.
I stand here today as governor of this sovereign state and refuse to willingly submit to illegal usurpation of power by the central government.
President Kennedy was forced to federalize National Guard troops to remove Wallace. Civil rights leaders were pleased to see the president finally use the bully pulpit for their cause.
But they have a right to expect that the law will be fair. That the Constitution...
On June 12th, the Wallace...
But imagine, like having to send the army to remove the governor of a state who won't let black students go to school in a state. We're like, yeah, good job, Kennedy, but like, think about why that's even necessary. It's freaking wild. As you see in the newspaper, Alabama admits Negro students. Wallace bows to federal force. Kennedy sees a moral crisis in the U.S. So now we have two presidents who both acted on civil rights. What have both of them done? Yeah, but think about the fact that both of them had to use the military to force a school to comply with a Supreme Court decision. That's wild. We have Eisenhower and high schools, and we have Kennedy and colleges, which is good. We are making progress, but my God. Right? There's George Wallace, looking really tough. Saying, nope, we had to have a long neck. Don't worry, he gets shot later. And paralyzed. And you can't feel anything from the neck down, which is a long way down because it's a long neck. Yeah. So, but again, we're starting to see some seeds of momentum. Some seeds of momentum. Right, here we have, I know it is. Put it over here. We have, for the first time, African American students being admitted to the University of Alabama, and now we're making some progress, but the South is not coming lightly. Now, this is the first thing JFK does good on civil rights. It's not enough. By 1963, MLK and the growing civil rights movement is very upset that nothing has been done on civil rights the way they were promised it would be. JFK's been dragging his feet. Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there. Yeah, we'll get there. And what we start seeing is the Southern activists, this activism side of things, getting a little more aggressive. And in 1963, what happens is they move that aggression to Birmingham, Alabama. Now, we see the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, an important activist group. Now we're talking about the SCLC, we're talking about CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, and this group is going to start protesting peacefully for the right to vote in Birmingham, Alabama. Now they picked Birmingham on purpose. Birmingham is in fact their second choice of city. Their first city, I forget the name of it, is somewhere in Georgia. No. They protest, and they keep getting arrested. peacefully and set free. They're not getting the reaction they want. So their second choice is Birmingham because they know for a fact the police commissioner or police chief in Birmingham is a crazy, aggressive racist. And he will give them what they want. What do they want? They want violence. They want footage for the news. They want aggression. His name is Bull Connor, and he does exactly what they think he's going to do. He uses dogs, he uses fire hoses, he uses tear gas, he uses rubber bullets, and he plays right into their hands, using brutal force to end the protests. Aggressive, over force to end the protests, and putting MLK and other leaders in jail. But what happens because of this is everybody in America gets to tune in and see this happening on their evening news. And Americans, upon first seeing it, they think to themselves, oh, this isn't America, this isn't some communist country. Because it looks like the kind of oppressive regimes that we keep going on and on about how we're saving the world from them. It's not happening in Russia, it's not happening in North Korea, it's not happening in North Vietnam, it's not happening in Iran. It's happening in Alabama. So in this context of the Cold War, America is so eager to be portrayed as the good guy that seeing this on their evening news is monumentally important. As we try to tell the rest of the world we're the good guys, what's happening in Europe when this is on the news? Oh, I thought America was the good guy. Everybody's happy with democracy. And they have police dogs biting black people? Doesn't seem so happy. Police brutality helps sway public opinion. You cannot win a war without public support. As the public opinion starts to turn on this issue, so too does JFK, and it's this event that begins the framework or the foundation for what becomes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's this event that allows JFK the amount of support to say we need to do something on civil rights. Here are some pictures from the event, which I think are quite shocking. The use of fire hoses. Sir? The use of police dogs. Very famous picture of a protester with his hands down, knocked out of trouble, being bit by a dog in the streets of Birmingham. And it is this protest and then the subsequent arrest which allows MLK to write his very famous, that I know you guys all read last year in Ms. Newman's class, letter from a Birmingham jail, which becomes really this foundational document of nonviolent protest in the civil rights movement. So MLK really becomes the leading voice on civil rights after the Birmingham protests and arrest. And it is that leads us to the real March on Washington, not the threatened one from World War II, but the actual March on Washington. Again, trying to keep the pressure on JFK to move on civil rights. Activists, if it works for activists, is they're looking for pressure and what? What else are they trying to do? They're all trying to promote something. Pressure and publicity, exposure. It's in 1963 that all four of the main activist groups, CORE, SNCC, the NAACP, and the SCLC, organized this huge march on Washington with 200,000 civil rights protesters together. It was, at the time, the biggest public protest in American history. The biggest public protest in American history. It's here that MLK gives his very famous I Have a Dream speech. I Have a Dream speech, which is really rooted in the idea of we, of us, of judging people on their qualities, of their character, not their color. And the response to this I Have a Dream speech in this March on Washington is the Civil Rights Act. It's this event that has JFK begin working on the foundations, this and the Birmingham event of the Civil Rights Act, and then he dies. Then he dies. So maybe Eliam can say that he was going to get more done on civil rights, but he has 2.5 years and does nothing on civil rights, except using the military to force the integration of Alabama, and then he's dead. So November 22nd, 1963, JFK is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, leaving Lyndon Baines Johnson as president for the next year. Right, it's November of 63. We're going to have an election in November of 64. So LBJ has 1 year of a presidency before he has to run for re-election. Now, what should he do in his year of presidency? What would be the safe thing to do? Not do anything. Right? If he wants to get re-elected in 1964, he should not piss off the South. Think about it. Right? If he's a Southern Democrat, if he tries to hold the Democratic Party together, the smart thing for him to do politically is to take it safe and take it easy. He does the opposite. LBJ, of course, has been a politician for a long time. He was the leader of the Senate for a while as a senator from Texas. He's a very good vice president. But what he does instead is promises to continue LBJ's liberal agenda to push for more government progress. And he actually, by far, exceeds JFK's record on economic progress, racial progress, social progress, etc. In the next 5 years, LBJ is going to push through, this is just an opinion on my part, but I will back it up by an argument if you need me to, pushes through the biggest array of liberal legislation in our country's history. In the next 5 years, we do more on liberal social legislation, political legislation, economic legislation, to try to pick people out of poverty, push for political equality, push for social equality, than any other president in American history. The only one who can kind of rival him is FDR. The only one who can kind of rival him is FDR. And they were, of course, dealing with two very different programs. One is trying to end the Depression. The other is trying to actually make America a great place. I laugh all the time when President Trump puts on Twitter, me and my administration has done more in our first 2 years than any president in American history. He says that all the time. And I'm like, dude, I can give you 36 examples of presidents who didn't, but just LBJ and FDR by themselves run circles around you. So there he is. We'll talk about him a ton on Monday, and again on Wednesday. But his presidency is marked by this great society he's trying to build. And now he's following through on this line of presidents who believe in naming their policies. Who was the first president who really named his domestic policies? Teddy, right? The Square Deal, right? And then we have Wilson's New Freedoms. We have FDR's New Deal. What was Truman's called? Fair Deal, right? And then Eisenhower's Modern Republicanism. Kennedy's was called New Frontier, right? And then now we have the Great Society of LBJ. But really what he's trying to do is declare war on poverty. He grew up super poor in a rural neighborhood, a rural area of Texas, outside Austin, Texas. Very, very poor. His dad was actually given jobs by the New Deal. His first job is working in a New Deal built school as a elementary school teacher. He's a really offensive man. It's a hilarious thing of teaching elementary school. But he witnessed firsthand as a teacher how hard it was for kids, largely kids of Hispanic backgrounds, in rural Texas, trying to get an education. So he comes off as a really gruff dude, but he has a very soft spot for poverty and a soft spot for marginalized communities. Under him, we'll see the most success in the civil rights movements. Under him, though, we'll start seeing the counterculture, the hippie, anti-war protest movement. Under him, we start seeing the New Seneca Falls, the National Organization for Women. And of course, under him, we see Vietnam, which I'll save for Monday. So the first thing he does as president, like literally before Kennedy's even in the grave, is push through two key bills that Kennedy had fought for. He's able to get them passed where Kennedy could not. The first is a reduction in income taxes for the lower and middle class of society to help with jobs and consumer spending. But the more important thing he does almost immediately upon taking the White House is push for passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What MLK and the civil rights activists have been asking for 3 years, he gets it done in less than 3 months. The Civil Rights Act of 64 declares all segregation in public facilities illegal. So public parks, public water fountains, public buses, that all sorts of segregation, if you are in public, is illegal. And it also begins working to protect existing black voting rights, voter registration, etc. What's crazy here, this act is not that, by itself, that monumental. This part is pretty big. It's not the one thing that the African Americans have been fighting for. They've been fighting more for voting rights. But what's crazy to think about, though, is this is the first piece of race law since Reconstruction. America has not passed a law to benefit minorities a significant law to benefit minorities since Reconstruction. That's 100 years ago. For 100 years, America just ignores racial progress. Yes, there was a Civil Rights Act passed in 1957, but it was so marked up and chopped down to nothing that it was, in effect, absolutely meaningless. This is the first important piece of legislation for race in America in 100 years. It's a long time. It's a long, long time. Considering American history is also only, how old are we? What's 1789 to 1776 to now? 25. Yeah, we're 250 years old. We'll call ourselves 250 years old. Right? So for 100 of those years, we have slavery. And then the next 100 of those years, after that little window of Reconstruction, we ignore racial progress. So of those 250 years old that we are, roughly, 200 of them have been marked by either Jim Crow or slavery. Math. 1964, LBJ runs for his election 1 year after taking the White House. He runs against two important people. One is Barry Goldwater. He's an important name in this story. He's a very conservative Republican. He's from Arizona. He's going to reject LBJ's liberal programs on race, on welfare, on war on poverty. Like conservatives, he wants small government, small spending, states' rights. And he also calls LBJ weak on communism. This is important for Monday's conversation. This is the way to do it if you are a politician in the Cold War. You call your opponent weak on communism. But in this case, LBJ is going to respond to this by ramping up aggression in Vietnam. That's why I say so. He also runs against George Wallace. George Wallace runs for president here in 1964. George Wallace will also run for president in 1968. And it is there that he will get attempted to be assassinated. So he runs against two people who are obviously anti-civil rights, anti-social progress, and he wins in an absolute landslide. Check it out. Check it out. So what does that say? That back-to-back elections, America has elected JFK, young, social, liberal, Catholic, and then LBJ, again, super socially liberal, pushing for civil rights, progress. What does it say that America now by 1964 has done this 2 elections in a row? What do you guys think? Talk to me.
They're more socially culturally.
Yeah, America's pushing for progress. Right? We speak with our elections, and our elections have said that not only does LBJ win, but Democrats win the House, Democrats win the Senate, which gives us a situation in which Democrats have access to pushing for more social change than they have since the New Deal. It's a big deal. It's a big deal. There's our map. But look, Goldwater wins Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and his state of Arizona. That's it. Now, a question for you guys. Think about this. In 1960s America, where are the poorest Americans? They're in rural areas. Where are the most rural areas in America? In the South. Think about this for a second. Who is the candidate that's trying to end poverty? Guys, we just talked about it. Take a second. Yeah. So Johnson's trying to end poverty. He wants to use the government, hire people, push for progress, create programs, get people to work. He's declaring war on poverty. That's what he's running for president on. That's one. The other guy says, no, states' rights, small government, look out for yourself. If you were super poor, who would you vote for? Think about it. Would you vote for Johnson if you were super poor? So what does it say that the poorest Americans vote for Goldwater? Think about it. I'm not going to say that, but yes. What does it say that the people who would benefit most from a war on poverty vote for the other guy? Because the guy who wants to declare war on poverty also wants to give civil rights. It says a lot. You can learn a lot from election maps. A war on poverty would benefit these people. LBJ was a poor person in rural areas here. And yet, because of the idea of pushing for civil rights, don't play Fortnite. I will come to your house. What's this one you played on? What? What do you think? What system do you play your game Fortnite on? Cool. I will come to your house today after school and I will punt your Xbox over your space. Cool. Excellent. Glad you got 5. I will punt all 5 of them. And you will not stop me. Blink one more time in class. Blink one more time. You want some tape? Staple your eyes open? Hold on. Blink again. Up, up, up. I swear to God, if you blink in my class one more time. Take one hand like this, and that way you can take notes. You ready? You're not. I got more markers than you have Xboxes. I'll keep throwing them. So, Christoph, what does it say that the South still votes Republican in 1964?
That they're like that.
That's a one way to put it. Thank you for yeah, that's why I said that first. So, LBJ gets elected on a landslide, but civil rights groups are still not content. In 1964, we see Freedom Summer, in which we see thousands of white and black college students going to the South to help Mississippians register to vote. And it's 1965 that gives us our most famous protest, the march from Selma to Montgomery, which had inspired the movie Selma, which I hope some of you have seen. Anybody seen the movie Selma? Yes, thank God. 2 of you. Great. We'll be watching it after the AP test. It's a phenomenal movie. But these people, these black civil rights activists with some white supporters as well, largely other clergy or their church members, are going to march from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery to try to protest their inability to register to vote. Now, we already know what's happened in places like Montgomery, but what we see as a result is what's called Bloody Sunday. I'll show you a clip in a second. Bloody Sunday, which shocks people in the North more than any other event. Again, public opinion. As we see police officers on horses trampling, clubbing, hitting, running over black people that are peacefully protesting, it is these types of events playing out on Americans' TVs, shows, on their news, that really start to sway public opinion. No, they don't march very far at all. They march to the bridge and then they die.
600 people gathered at Brown Chapel AME Church on Sunday, March 7th, to begin the march to Montgomery. Dr. King was preaching in Atlanta. Hosea Williams and John Lewis led the march. Lewis chose to march even though his organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, opposed SCLC's strategy and decided not to take part. Surprisingly, as they walked through the center of town, there were no police in sight. The route out of Selma crossed over the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
There's John Lewis, the guy I talked about. So he's gone from riding on these buses and getting beat up to going to this march, he's about to get beat up, to later again running and winning for Congress and being in Congress for like 28 years. No, he's black.
It be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You have to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue.
So people see this footage of tear gas, of police on horses trampling people, and if you don't know what this is, and you don't know what's really happening in America in the South, you don't think this is America. Keep in mind, if you live far from the South, right, like TV's a relatively new thing. Right, we look at this back now like, oh, people are, no. People with their news on, they assume what they're seeing is in some third world country fighting against communism. And then come to find out it's happening in Alabama. No, they can't. So great question. Does the government try to censor it? No. Yeah, but we have the freedom of the press, and we'll talk about that with Vietnam, because that's going to pop back. It's a great question. It's going to pop back up in probably next Thursday with Nixon. Nixon tries to censor the New York Times from releasing a bunch of stuff about Vietnam. And he goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, so, sorry, you can't. Right? The First Amendment protects the freedom of the rights to publish whatever, freedom of the press to publish whatever they want.
President Johnson, sensing the mood of the country, addressed Congress on national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which...
So this gives LBJ a chance to speak to the country. He's just been sworn in as president shortly beforehand, right? It's 5 or 6 days after the Selma disaster. And he has a chance to speak to the American public and to speak to Congress in what I personally consider one of the 4 or 5 most important speeches in American history. You'll see why. It's a speech on civil rights. Speech on voting rights.
reaches into every section and state of America. Which
national television.
What happened in Selma is part of a far larger movement which reaches into every section and state of America. It is
8 days after Bloody Sunday, 4 days after Reeb's death, the president asked for a comprehensive voting rights bill and astonished the nation by using the words of the movement.
Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice.
Very important line. It's not just Negroes, it's all of us who need to overcome this crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. That it's all of our job to move ourselves forward and get over what's happened and move ourselves past the legacies of bigotry and slavery.
And we shall overcome.
Lights, please, sir. Now, that line right there, we shall overcome. I'm not asking you to know where it comes from, because I'll tell you. It comes off of what are called Negro spirituals, or songs, hymns sung in black churches and sung for generations. One of the most famous of them is called We Shall Overcome. So imagine being a racist white person and seeing your white Southerner president using that phrase, we shall overcome, and thinking to yourself how much your world is changing. Also think of yourself as an African American in America in the 1960s and seeing the president after all of this reciting this line, we shall overcome. It is here that LBJ asks for and gets the support of Congress in passing the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The speech is there for you to read on your own time. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then we'll be done for the day, finally bans literacy tests. It does what Reconstruction did and then failed, and sends voting officials into the South to protect African Americans' right to vote. As of 1965, by now we've passed our Civil Rights Act, ending segregation, our Voting Rights Act, which guarantees access to the ballot. We've passed a new amendment which bans poll taxes in all states. And then we have the data to prove it as well. All right, the number in red is the number of registered African-American voters in 1960. The number in blue is the number of registered voters African-American descent in 1966. I want to call your attention to Mississippi. Dude, 700% increase in Mississippi. South Carolina, a 230% increase. Alabama, a 280% increase. As for the first time, African Americans become a strong, aggressive voting bloc in American politics since Reconstruction. Since Reconstruction. Now, the last thing to point out, though, and then we're done for the day. I'll do all the Great Society stuff on Wednesday. The last thing to point out is that it takes all three. It takes the protest movements to draw attention. It takes the legal system to create precedent, and it creates a politician like Johnson who's willing to push for the change on the congressional and legislative level with things like the 25th Amendment, Civil Rights Act, and Voting Rights Act. So I'll hit the the Great Society side of Johnson on Wednesday. But please account for all three in your understanding of the civil rights movement and its successes. The bell is going to ring shortly. Your homework is not due until Monday, and it is very minimal. It's just 2 secondary essays. 2 secondary essays, one on the civil rights movement, one on Vietnam. I went light on you guys.